So Blaine, one thing you mentioned earlier was the kind of stuff you like doing, the plyometrics, the jumps. It seems as though from watching your training, from watching the Instagram videos you put up, you tend to put those as like almost as a primer at the start of your weightlifting sessions.
Yeah.
Is that just a factor of Instagram editing where you're actually doing those in a separate session earlier on, or do you actually use them as a direct primer for your weightlifting movements before a
Oh,
session?
yeah, 100%. I use it as a primer before the session, just because like it's the most explosive thing I'm going to be doing. So I like to do that first. And then I also like to use that as kind of a gauge on where I kind of feel that I'm at. So I don't have like specific percentages that I need to be at on a certain day. I kind of have like a range of like I need to be in this area where I'm going to be. So like let's say I'm doing like on Monday I had snatch doubles and it was between 135 and 145. So I'm using my jumps and it's like if I feel like I'm snapping off the ground and things are just flying, it's like I know I'm going to be closer to that 145 number for my lifts. And if I feel like the jumps are just heavier than they should feel, then I might be down closer to that 135 number. And this is a good, I've always done this to kind of gauge how that training session is going to be. And we used to do this at the training center where we would actually have like force plates though. So we would get on the force plate, do a vertical jump. We would get a very specific number of like, this is where you're at. And we can kind of gauge your training off of that versus I don't have force plates here. And it's just an easy way to kind of just feel it out. Like I've done enough plyometrics and different variations and all this kind of stuff where I know how things should feel. And I know when things are on point or when things feel a little off. So I definitely use that to kind of prime the session, kind of use it as like an additional warm up, and then use it to kind of gauge like, all right, this is how things are feeling. So I need to set my expectations that things might be off today, or set my expectations of if things are good, then we're going to cook and we're going to try to get us that higher end of whatever rep range that I'm supposed to be at for the day.
How do you decide what variation of plyometrics you do? Because you do more plyometric variations than I've seen anyone else doing, I think, in training.
Yeah, I kind of just like I'll have my training block and I'll pick out two to three types of jumps because I usually will do some sort of jump 3 times a week because that's usually my weightlifting program right now is I've got some variation of snatch and clean and jerk on Monday, some variation of snatch and clean and jerk on Wednesday, and then some variation of snatch and clean and jerk on Friday. So I'll have three variations of like whatever jump I want to do. And I don't really have a specific way to kind of pick like what's going to transfer over to weightlifting the best. I just kind of use like if it's an early block and I'm not getting super like I'm still 12, 16 weeks out from when a competition is, then I'm just choosing any type of jump that I want to do and I'll use that for 4 weeks and then switch it up and use the same thing for 4 weeks. That way I can kind of get the same feel week after week and see how things are going. As I get closer to a meet or a competition, what I like to do is add in some sort of like depth jump variation because those are going to be the most intense. And the depth jump specifically is the one thing that I do feel transfers over into like weightlifting a lot, specifically the jerk. As I've noticed, like the times that I've hit my biggest depth jumps, and I always use the same height boxes, and I can just kind of feel how I spring off of those, are also the times I've seen huge improvements, specifically like in the jerk. So like the better jumper I've become, usually the better jerk that I can kind of feel off of that. So I'll use it in that sense, but yeah, I have no specific variations of like, oh, this jump transfers over to the snatch the best, or this jump transfers over to the clean. I just go, all right, I'm going to do some sort of counter movement jump. I'm going to do some sort of single leg variation, and then I'm going to do some sort of seated jump. So I'll have one from a static position using both legs, a single leg jump, and then some sort of like a counter movement preload type jump. And that's usually the outline that I use. And I'll just kind of throw those in and change them up every 4 to 6 weeks as I feel I need to.
Lane, where did you did you figure out that depth jump thing anywhere, or did you figure that out by yourself?
I figured it out by myself.
You
So
know, you know what's really interesting about that is so in the 80s, the Russians correlated the depth jump with increasing total. So they used to call it like the shock method. So Medvedev when it came to peaking for competition. So they'd add the depth jump in at select times throughout the year, and they'd see like meaningful increases in weightlifters' totals, like elite level weightlifters by like 5-10 kilos. I think that the jerk was correlated with 20% of the body weight on a barbell jump. But that's very, very interesting that you found the exact same thing as them, which is very, very interesting, and how useful depth jumps can be when you're jumping. That's crazy.
Yeah. So when I started CrossFit in 2014, that's also like when I started doing the majority of the clean, like of my Olympic lifting. And I'd always used depth jumps, and something I started learning early is like whenever I would do depth jump, there'd be like a 3-week period where everything just felt easier. All my weights were flying, the jerk was easier, the clean was easier, squatting felt easier. But then there'd be like a week or two period after where everything felt extremely hard. Like 80% felt like 100%. And then it started clicking where I was like, all right, I need to put that in certain places to where when I want to hit big numbers, it's there, because I always feel like garbage 2 weeks after it happens. So it was kind of trial and error. And then, yes, I have read that study at Verkhoshansky's shock method book. They specifically said, I don't remember the exact like volumes, but they would do like within a tire peaking block, they would do upwards of like 200 repetitions of a depth jump, and they would see 10 kilo. I think one person even did like a 20 kilo increase on their total just by adding those in for 3 weeks. And that's when I read that, I was like, oh man, I accidentally did this and kind of stumbled across it. Because we did depth jumps when I was playing football. Like I love doing that variation the most, but I'm very aware that like I can only do it for a couple weeks before things start to feel like trash, and then I see a decrease in performance. So I actually just started doing depth jump, like a really easy depth jump variation now to kind of get ready, because I know I've got a month and a half. So in about 3 weeks, I'll start adding in those specific depth jumps for the meet that I have coming up. But yeah, it was kind of like stumbled across on it just based off how things were feeling. And then once I read that, I was like, okay, that makes sense. And that kind of validified my own theory on what things we're working with.